Welcome to The Owl Hoot, a podcast for the environmentally curious, with me, Caroline Norbury. On each episode, I chat with a guest who contributes in some way to protecting the planet on matters of climate change, sustainability, biodiversity and pollution. Here is a place where you can gain new knowledge and be inspired. Enjoy listening. On the podcast today, I welcome two members of the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust team, George Jones and Ady Cox. George is a Wilder Communities Officer and has previously worked for the National Trust. Ady is a nature recovery advisor, following roles as an ecologist with two consultancies. He also volunteers with the Derbyshire Bat Group. Together they are involved in the Derwent Connections project, aiming to improve woodland habitat connectivity and reduce flood risk, with the help of community engagement. So, without further ado, let's find out more about them and the project. Welcome, George and Ady. So I always start to get to know my guests on the podcast. So if we could start, maybe Ady, you first. Tell me a bit about what led you to work in the environmental sector and to this particular role within the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust.
So when I was at university, I studied ecology and zoology. My actual degree was biological sciences, but we could kind of pick the bits that interested us, and they were just the bits that I was generally drawn to. And then when I graduated, I was trying to find work that was relevant to the degree I'd done, and that led to me to working as a consultant ecologist. So mostly working in the private sector, advising on a lot of planning applications and things like that with respect to protected species legislation, and helping and making sure that developers had what they needed to meet their environmental obligations with respect to ecology and habitats and things like that. So I worked there for about 5 or 6 years in that sector, and then was just looking for a bit of a career change, and had always liked the idea of working in conservation. So that's how and then I applied for and got a job at the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust.
Excellent. George, is it a similar story for you or something a little bit different?
I suppose it's a little bit different for me because I didn't originally start out for a career in conservation. I originally started out on sort of like an adventure activity pathway, so mountain leading, climbing, that sort of stuff. So I started at university. I studied outdoor adventure leadership and management, so not particularly focused on conservation or the environment as such, but stuff you do within the wild environment. But in my last year, I became more interested and focused on sort of forest schools, bushcraft and all that sort of stuff, and how benefits of people participating in that can, in the outdoors and the environment, can really benefit them. And then obviously always been interested in outdoors and nature and woodland and the environment as a whole, but I never really saw myself in that as a job. But then after leaving uni, got a job for the National Trust, and then sort of started to focus more on that conservation side and educating people around it and things like that. So it's more my role in conservation is more educating people on how they can become involved and working with community groups, which sort of developed from the forest school stuff and bringing people in for wellbeing programs and things like that. So I sort of stumbled into it that way, rather than set out on sort of like an ecology degree and things like that. So I sort of came in it in a roundabout way.
It's always fascinating to hear people's paths through their career, because sometimes it can be just happenstance, can't it? And just being in the right place, or things just happening in a sort of occurring as things arise. So you both here from the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, and you both connect on this particular project. Ady, perhaps you can start us off by telling us how this particular Derwent Connections project came about, and what the premise is behind it.
Yeah, so the very wide-ranging idea of the project is basically that in Derbyshire, we're sort of in the middle of two large-scale tree planting schemes, essentially. So there's the National Forest, which goes across Leicestershire, Staffordshire and parts of South Derbyshire. And then right in the north of the county, there's also the new Northern Forest Initiative, which is the large forest scheme that the government are wanting to implement between the sort of east and west coast and the north of the county. And Derbyshire sits right in between those two initiatives. And the idea of the project is essentially to increase woodland cover between those two big forests. So in doing so, that will allow better connectivity between those in terms of habitats. It will allow species, as climate change becomes sort of more and more of a problem, it'll mean that species will find it easier to move up north and north south between these different like patches of habitats. And then basically the River Derwent runs in a big valley all the way through the middle of the county. So it in terms of that catchment, that river catchment makes up the vast majority of Derbyshire. So it's a way of encompassing quite a lot of Derbyshire and increasing woodland cover between those two sort of tree planting schemes, basically.
Okay, that's a really good outline. You mentioned there the connectivity. Perhaps, George, can you pick up on that point? Why is it important to connect these forests together?
Connecting these forests together is a really important outcome of the project, because at the moment the woodland and the habitats sit within little pockets, so there's not much connectivity between them. So connecting these woodlands and the forests up creates this corridor for species and nature to move through from one area to another. So instead of them just existing in sort of isolation, it provides this route for them to move. And this is really important as well, because with climate change and when temperatures are rising, species want to move from south to north, it gives them a route through rather than just being trapped within these areas. So yeah, that's right, it's really important connecting these woodlands up.
So what you're saying is the ecosystem is more likely to thrive if they can make this movement between different areas. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. So instead of them just being sort of existing in isolation, and then if something happens to that patch of woodland, that habitat gone, it gives them somewhere to move. So it really helps them to spread more through the Derwent Valley and move between the areas of woodland and forest. Okay,
George, you can tell me about the time frame in terms of the project that you hope to get off the ground, because I know it's about funding, isn't it? Is there an end point to the project?
Yeah, so this year of funding ends in March 2023, but the whole point of this year is to set out mechanisms and help towards our 2050 vision. So although this funding ends this year, it's putting in place toolkits and ways we can work with people and ways we can help landowners, community groups to achieve our 2050 vision of this corridor through from the national forest to the northern forest. So although this is quite a 1-year project that I'm working on in particular, it actually helps to set out and achieve a 2050 vision. So it should last 30 years, the impacts, and onwards after that.
Okay, so obviously it's an ongoing project, and like all of these particular areas that in environmental crises, that they're going to require lots of different inputs and they all interact, so it's all quite complicated. What is it that you hope to achieve in this short-term frame within communities?
So within community groups in particular, it's setting them up to do woodland creation and natural flood management by themselves in their own communities. So although we're going in and providing guidance and support on the ground, say if they've got a tree planting project going on, or they're looking to build natural flood processes, we'll initially be there to help that this year. So we'd help on events, with education, with training. But then the idea is that once we've had this input, they can then carry on those works separate of us. So sort of helps the longevity of the project a little bit then. So it's sort of not making them reliant on us, like we're there to help this year, but we want them to be able to do these things within their own communities into the future.
Okay, that makes sense. And how do communities know that they can use you as a resource in this short-term period?
So we've been doing a lot of actually contacting community groups. So we've been going out, searching out groups to work with us in our areas that we want to focus on. We've also been putting out lots of social media posts, there's web pages. So they can always get in contact with us through those ways. On our website, we've got a specific Derwent Connections page, which then has a community group section, which they can get in touch with us through there if they're interested in working with us. But we go to a lot of events, and quite a lot of people come up and talk to us. So we've been doing a lot of networking events, so community focused. So that's been a really useful way to get in touch with us. We're also working with a lot of parish councils and hopefully more in the future who have also been pointing us towards groups in their area. But if anyone else wants to get in touch with us, they can just get in touch through the website or email in Derbyshire Wildlife Trust.
Okay.
And that'll get passed to me.
Excellent. And Ady, where do you sit within the project?
So my role specifically is I'm working on the woodland creation aspect of it. So there's kind of three main parts of it. The first is the community engagement stuff that George was just talking about. And then there's the woodland creation, which is a part that I'm working on. And then something called natural flood management, which is something that perhaps I guess we'll talk about a little bit later. But I am basically involved in going out and speaking to landowners that are interested in planting woodland and being part of the project, talking to them about means of getting funding to plant trees and how to look after trees, and to try and think about the best places within their land to put trees. So it's not just about putting trees wherever, it's about putting them in a place that makes sense so that it's connecting up existing woodlands, existing habitats, so that it's contributing to reducing flooding. And then also giving them sort of more specialised, I suppose, ecological advice on species and things like that, to make sure that we're getting woodlands that have the most benefit for our native biodiversity. So we're making sure that we've got native species in the right parts of Derbyshire.
And when you say landowners, are you talking about people that have agricultural land or just people that own private land? What sort of land owners are you involved with?
So it's actually quite a mix, to be honest with you. It depends on how they come to us. So what we found is we've had a few different ways of trying to get in touch with people. So we've run Facebook ads, we've gone to agricultural shows. Some of them are just people that other people in the trust have been speaking to and have said and have mentioned something in passing, and at that point they've been passed on to us. So I've worked with farmers, I've worked with people that have got just a tiny, like small holding or a small field that just happens to be next to a river in some places. So it really does vary quite a lot. Obviously, in terms of our objectives, the bigger the better, but we're certainly not turning people away. We're interested in speaking to anyone that is interested in getting involved, really.
And how receptive are landowners to changing their land and perhaps making it more biodiverse by planting trees or growing particular areas in different ways?
So they're not resistant to the idea of it. It's more a case of making it pay. So especially when we're talking in the context of farmers, so you end up talking to people and obviously they're kind of running the land as a business, really, and they get given government grants and subsidies for managing land in a certain way. And the vast majority of the time, the people that we've spoken to so far anyway, they're really interested and they really want to do their bit for nature and they really want to get involved in this sort of stuff. But they're balancing that against the realities of running a business and making money and putting food on the table. So at the moment, one of the barriers that we're kind of coming up against is the fact that the incentives for planting woodland are not always there, and where they are there, they're kind of in their infancy. So there's for example, there's a scheme called the Woodland Carbon Code, where effectively it can be quite complicated, but the basic principle of it is that people get paid money for planting trees, which then take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and obviously that's something that mitigates the effects of climate change. So the idea being that you would get a set amount of money per unit of carbon dioxide that you draw out of the air. Now that's a really good idea in principle, but it's kind of, because it's quite a new concept, people are a little bit reluctant to jump into it without being able to calculate the costs long term. And then they're also balancing up against, because of Brexit, we've come out of the European Union, which means that the systems of subsidies that farmers receive for their land is changing as well. So there's a bit, we're in transitional phase still with that, where people are still receiving sort of funding from there, and that's going on over the next 5 years. So people are kind of in a bit of limbo and trying to work out what works best for them. So in amongst all of that, I'm basically going in and trying to convince them that the best thing that they can do is plant woodland, or at least integrate woodland and manage their land slightly differently.
That's so interesting, because it's quite a complex picture, as all these things are. But the fact that, obviously there's that economic financial structure that it needs to be sustainable. And it's so interesting that you mentioned there that there could be payment for this effectively carbon dioxide drawdown, but it sounds like it's not easy to calculate and to be dependent on. Does the payment only occur once the trees are at a particular stage? How does that, or is it a bit of an unknown quantity?
I'm not an expert in it, but I believe what happens is that basically they have, this scheme has people that independently come out and verify it. So they'll come out every set number of years, they'll look at the woodland, they'll say, okay, it's growing in the way that we expect it to be growing, or it's not growing in the way that we expect it to be going, and then they'll calculate the amount of carbon dioxide that it's taken out of the atmosphere on that basis, and then calculate the amount of money that landowners can sell their carbon credits on that basis. So probably should have explained that actually, is that basically, so they get these accredited carbon credits, and then they can sell those to, for example, big businesses that are looking to offset their carbon emissions. So an obvious example would probably be airlines, I would have thought, where they're looking to reduce their carbon footprint by contributing to woodland planting schemes or that sort of thing. So they're buying these carbon credits as a means of reducing their overall carbon emissions, or offsetting their carbon emissions is probably better, because they're not actually reducing them, they're just mitigating the effect of them.
Yeah, no, I completely understand what you're trying to say there. That sounds like a very interesting ongoing prospect for progress, but it's the surety, I guess, that people, when they're owning land and they're making money from the land, require. And it's, as you say, it's all a little bit up in the air. So you've got this land use sort of sector, you've got the community, and then you also mentioned the flooding. Ady, perhaps you can tell me a little bit about how the flooding aspect fits in with this project.
So it's a concept called natural flood management, and the idea of that is that it's looking at nature-based solutions to reducing flood. So obviously traditionally you would have looked at, in terms of flood management, you'd have looked at putting in hard defences and having engineering solutions. So you'd have flood defence walls, you'd have dredging of channels, you'd if you're trying to use land for agriculture and you want to drain it because it's really damp, they would put in like drains to try and get the water off the land as fast as possible. But all that has had the effect that what happens is when we get really heavy periods of rainfall, the rain falls on the land, it goes straight into these drains and it all rushes down into the main river channel, which eventually is the Derwent, and then it flows down south through the county and out into the River Trent. But it does it really, really fast. So when we have really high periods of rainfall, for example, like we've had earlier this week, all of the water hits the land at once, all rushes into the river all at once, and then the gap between when that peak rainfall is and when the river levels are at their highest is really, really small. So the way that we want to use natural flood management to combat this is basically, it's a little bit jargony, but the idea is that you're decoupling these events. So when we have really heavy rainfall, what you're trying to do is increase the amount of time that it takes from the rain to fall on the land and the rain to get into the river, and then having it, rather than just all rushing through the landscape, trickling through, and then rain from different parts of the counties all reaching the river at different times. So it doesn't all hit at once and it doesn't all come up really high at once. It sort of like rises and falls in a bit more of a manageable way. So how woodlands contributes to that is basically a few different ways. So tree roots increase the filtration ability of the soil, if that's the right term. So it basically means that the water can get into the soil more easily because it's not as compacted. If the rain falls onto leaves of woodlands rather than hitting the ground and rushing into the rivers, it literally stays on the leaves and then evaporates off. Trees obviously through their roots rely on water, so they take water up out of the soil, and then through something called transpiration, that goes back out into the atmosphere just through as a natural process of tree life cycles. And then other ways that we want to, it's not just about woodland creation on this project. We also have things called leaky wooden dams that we're really keen on putting in. So these are small scale interventions where essentially you're trying to mimic where in nature a tree or debris would fall into a watercourse, and then the water would hit that and trickle through rather than be able to get through so quickly. And it's all about this concept called slow the flow. And it's just all part of trying to slow the water from getting from the top of the land to the bottom of the land as fast as possible, which obviously was previously kind of the thinking was get the water off the land so that we can farm it. But now we're thinking we need to have a bit more of an integrated approach where we try and accept that some areas are going to be wet and work with that and use that as a means of managing flooding and alleviating it in certain places.
It's so curious that we're having to manage flooding in a way that we've got to try and mimic nature. I'm wondering whether that is because our ecosystems aren't where they should be and they can't do the job for us, or is it the fact that because of our climate change aspects where we are getting dry spells and heavy downpours, which is the more contributing factor to why we need to intervene and make sort of man-made dams? Is that a question perhaps you can answer, or is that beyond the scope of the project?
I can give it a go. I think as with all these things, it's a combination of both, really. So obviously we're seeing really prolonged dry periods and then right immediately afterwards really, really heavy rain. So because the land is so baked, all of the water just runs off immediately, and we're having more unpredictable weather. So the fact that it's harder to predict has an impact, obviously. And then also as a society, over the past a few thousand years since we've been here, we've changed the land in so many ways to sort of build a society and feed ourselves and all these different things. But I guess there's not always been an appreciation that natural processes have value. So if you think of it, I'm gonna have a go at the Victorians because it's just the trendy thing to do. But so if you think about Victorian engineering, they all almost felt like they were kind of masters of the natural world and it was theirs to bend to their will. But I think the thinking now is that we need to be a lot more holistic in our approach and we need to work with natural processes. And it doesn't mean just like rewilding the whole country. It just means trying to integrate it and trying to make space for nature rather than just forcing it to exist in the places that are inconvenient for us to do anything else with, really.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sort of clarifying that. George, so how does this fit, this whole leaky dam business? That's sounded a bit more strange than I intended. How does that fit with your community work? Is that something that community organisations can get involved in?
Yeah, 100%. So there's only so many Derbyshire Wildlife Trust staff and so many places that we've got that we're actually looking after. So what the hope is that with community groups in areas where we have landowners or reserves and things like that who are open to having woodland and other natural flood management processes put in, so like the leaky dams or contour dams on hillsides and stuff like that, they actually come in and help do that work in their local community. So they will see the benefit, they get to be involved in the processes and they learn how to do it as well. So it's not just us coming in telling them to put logs somewhere. They learn how to do it, so in the future, if they have somewhere else in their community, they can then go and do that themselves. But it's also working with like parish councils as well. So we're developing a parish council toolkit on how to do natural flood management and woodland creation within their area. So that includes lots of things from land use to talking to local landowners and everything like that. So it actually will hopefully broaden the impact that this has. So instead of it just being focusing on places where we go and talk to people and do things, actually parish councils can take it up on themselves with their local community and community groups that may exist in their area to actually do these processes. So particularly in places that are really impacted and flooding's a massive issue along the Derwent, then it sort of empowers these communities and parish councils to actually help improve the area themselves.
And are parish councils, are they very much aware of where their sort of flood points are? Do they know where the problems lie?
Yeah, so it depends on which parish councils you talk to. So the ones that we've spoken to at the moment, they are very aware of where the issues lie because they are from that community. They see the impacts year on year. They see the cost of the damage that comes through with the more frequent flooding. So they are very aware of where the problems lie. and they're very keen to be involved in helping solve those issues as well. So yeah, they're very aware of what the problems are, and that's why they're such a good resource as well, because they know who to talk to, they know where the most impact would be. They've got the drive to help as well, and they also know the local community. So some of the community groups that we've found haven't been on any sort of lists on sort of the CVS websites. We've been put in touch with them through the parish councils, so that they say, oh, you need to talk to this person, and that's been a really great resource, especially for my side of it. So yeah, they're very aware of where the issues are and how to start to help with them.
That's really good to hear. I mean, the theme through all of our conversation so far is the interconnectedness of the problems, but also the networking, the getting the different parts of the community on board. And although it's fairly in its infancy, this whole project, are you feeling some momentum? And is there anywhere that you've seen so far the fruits of having put some of this information down? Is the work being done, and can you see the success of that already in any places? Ady, perhaps do you want to just come in on that first?
So there's not work on the ground being done yet, because we're still in the stage of talking to people, drawing up plans for where we want to put the woodland, and doing applications for grants for funding, basically for the trees, for all the different things that are required to get this stuff planted, basically. But I think in terms of momentum, we've definitely seen an increase in people that are interested. It's definitely that there are a lot of people are already thinking about this. It's not just us going out and just saying this is what everyone should do. When you speak to people, they're like, I mean, kind of like what George was saying with the parish councils, they're fully aware that there is a problem, and they're just kind of trying to think of ways to address it. And the great thing about this project is it addresses loads of different things. It addresses flooding, it addresses climate change, biodiversity, gets communities engaged. You're trying to work with local people to find solutions to problems in their area rather than having a really top-down approach. So I think momentum's still building, but as George was saying before, the idea is that hopefully we're trying to have a legacy to this project where it won't just be us doing grant applications just for a year and then it stops. We want to kickstart a different way of thinking and a process that continues like long after the sort of initial phase of it has concluded.
George, are you getting the same feeling of this sort of momentum building?
Yeah, definitely. So in the initial stages, we've done a lot of work on the educational side of it. So working with community groups on educating their communities on stuff like that. But now we're starting to get, like say, that momentum building and groups actually wanting to create new woodland on plots of land they own, things like that. So it is definitely growing. We've been quite fortunate actually on this side because we've worked with a couple of groups who have actually had land themselves ready to go. So we've done little bits of woodland creation, we've done little bits of other stuff here and there. And as we move back into the tree planting season, we've got a few more coming up as well. But that's just because these groups have had places in mind already. They just needed that extra bit of support to move forward into doing them. But yeah, the momentum is definitely building from the start of this year to now. The interest and the involvement and the amount of people who are getting in touch has grown massively. But it's not just, we've been talking about large landowners, community groups as a whole, but there's actually been a lot of momentum being gained through people doing individual steps. So through our Team Wilder and sort of steps people can take at home, there's been a toolkit created by that team as called 15 Ways to Reduce Flooding at Home. And that has been amazingly well received by people. So all the educational and community events we've been going to, we've been handing them out to schools we've been to talk with, we've been giving them out to them. And people have been talking to us and coming back to us saying they've been taking steps out of it. So they've been planting their own veg, they've not been mowing their lawns, they've been putting water butts in. Some people with bigger areas have been looking at making their green roofs. So it's this whole, the momentum on that side has been massive as well. So it's not just these large projects that have been gaining momentum, but people are actually taking more individual steps as well. So that's been really good to see.
That's an interesting point that you make, because it's very empowering if somebody as an individual can do something themselves and it sounds like the sorts of things that you were talking about are reasonably accessible, not mowing your lawn, for instance. And then it also feeds into the bigger picture. I wonder whether if you get people as individuals engaged in doing things, whether they then join community groups and it sort of flourishes that way. Are you getting any sense of that sort of interaction between the two?
Yes, it's all about taking ownership, isn't it? I think so. When people start to be involved in these things, they feel more empowered to actually do more. So we've been one of my main outcomes is linking people together. So we give out these toolkits. We talk to people at events, but we also highlight what other community groups are in their area. So if they want to do more, they want to be involved, we say, oh, so you're within Derby. Have you ever spoken or looked at this group, or have you ever wanted to do more and want to actually volunteer for us on ways and things like that? So yeah, it's all about that, getting people. It's a good way to introduce them actually, and then they take that next step. But like you say, it's so accessible, that 15 ways. You can do it on any size area, and the little actions all add up in the end if enough people do them. So it's been really good.
I think that's a really great message as well, isn't it? As an individual, you can do something. It does count. It may, if we all do something, it all counts. And if you're part of a community group, great. You're expanding it even more. So I think that's a really good message. The interconnectedness, I really like that. Do you find, on a personal level, it's quite an exciting project to be involved in because it touches so many important environmental issues, and you get to talk to so many different types of people. How rewarding is it for you both? Ady, do you want to start?
Yeah, I really love it. I mean, it's basically just touches on all the things I really like, which is initially when I first started my career, I was just really interested in nature and working in a job that allowed me to work with nature. And then the more I sort of like got involved in it and read about it and thought about the issues, the more I was thinking that it needs to be a big interconnected joined up approach, and it needs to be a change in the way that our society thinks about the way that we manage our country, really. And then the other aspect of it is going out and speaking to people where they are and actually like just standing there and listening to them talk about the issues that they face. I think it's really like crucially important because we live in quite a divided, divisive age, and I just think people don't really go out and listen anymore. And as a wildlife trust, I think what we really want to do is engage with groups that maybe we wouldn't traditionally, they wouldn't traditionally feel like the wildlife trust was on their side. Say farmers, like sometimes people think, oh, we're just there to tell them what to do, and we're not. We're there to listen to what their problems are and try and find ways to work with them, which I'm really interested in and really passionate about. Is just like understanding people's issues and trying to work with them and trying to build bridges rather than criticizing everything that people do. I think it's much more productive and much more important. So yeah, from my perspective, I find it really interesting and really satisfying, and get a lot from it. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks for that. It's an interesting point that you make about working with farmers and the way you approach it and with them, because we all want to move forward in a positive way rather than going, oh no, you shouldn't be doing it like that. And I think it's really valuable, the way that you're coming at it.
Yeah, I think there has been like I think sometimes they feel a bit got at because they feel like they're under attack from all sides, and it's just nice to turn up and be like, no, I'm not here to like have a go at you. I'm here to like try and help. And it's just nice to feel like you're trying to understand someone, really.
Yes. If we could,
and they're not as scary as you think they are as well.
And they are endeavouring to try to put food on our table. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
we have to also remember that. George, what about from your perspective? What's it been like working on the project?
Yeah, it's been great. In particular, because I work through the whole of the Derwent catchment, so moving through that area and seeing the amount of community groups and the amount of individuals who are sort of trying to make a change and a positive impact in their community has been amazing, and sort of bringing those to the forefront and working with them and trying to connect these people up together it's been really good. And just seeing the diversity of groups out there as well and what they're trying to focus on. It's been really good actually, and seeing the positive impacts they're bringing to their local area. So from increasing tree coverage to having more fruit trees accessible and things like that, it's been creating spaces for people to go to, so community gardens and everything like that, and educating schools and school children on how they can make an impact. It's been a really good experience just to move through that catchment and see the level of impact and drive that people have had. Has been a really, really awesome part of this role. And actually being able to come in and help support and move these projects on and help make a bigger impact on an overall scale. It's been awesome, especially with the parish councils as well, talking to them and seeing like the drive and the shift that they want to do in their area to more sustainable and green and friendly spaces for their community as well. It's been really rewarding to be able to be a part of that. But yeah, we're hoping it can only move forward like this as well. So
yeah, and on that point, to finish with a final thought about the future, what are your personal thoughts and feelings about, because we're talking about quite complicated environmental issues that we're facing. How do you feel about the future of wildlife going forward?
I feel quite positive about it, more positive than I was at the start of this project, because having seen the different pockets of stuff that people are doing, so it's already happening out there. It's just about connecting them up and linking people to those areas. So I think it is, in my view, it is looking a bit more positive, just because the amount of community groups are out there and the great work they're doing and the drive that these individuals have to positively impact the environment and their area. I think it can only get better. But yeah, that's my hope as well.
Ady, what's your thoughts and feelings on the future of wildlife?
I think there's a lot of work still to be done, but I think it's definitely moving in the right direction. I think the vast majority of people in this country now recognise that it's not really something we can do without, and it's not just a thing that's nice to have. It's a thing that is fundamentally very, very important to the way that the world works, and it provides a lot of good to us. And we've just had a pandemic where everyone was stuck indoors quite a lot, and people realised the value of having access to nature and access to green spaces. And when you're talking to people at councils and big organisations, and then people on the ground, every different kind of person I've spoken to has recognised that there's a need to change the way that we approach these things. So I find that really encouraging.
Right, that's great. I love that. Encouraging. That's what we need to move forward. Thank you so much to both of you, George and Ady, this morning for talking about the Derwent Connections project. It's a super project and has so many wins, and it can involve so many people. So if there are other people out there wanting to get involved, definitely do get in touch with you both or the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. Thanks again this morning. It's been wonderful.
No problem. It's been great. Thanks for having us on.
Cheers.
It was super interesting to hear about the Derwent Connections project with George and Ady. It totally encompasses benefits to nature and places whilst strengthening communities. There seems to be so many positives: ensuring wildlife can travel in response to changes in climate, managing the increased risk of floods, and connecting community groups. Collaborative effort has never been more valuable than it is now, and they highlighted the varied groups of people they are engaging with. We can all get involved in creating a new landscape, whether as an individual or within community groups. And organisations such as the Wildlife Trust are always keen to gain new volunteers. So see the links to a trust near you in the show notes. I'd like to thank Andy Shaw for audio editing, Jeremy Jones for providing the music, and to you for listening. Don't forget you can follow the podcast to get automatic access to each new episode. And it would be lovely if you could rate, review and share it too. It really helps. Until next time, bye for now.